Garrett Holbrook stepped onto his porch expecting to see the red barn, the corral, and the century-old grain silo that had stood sentinel over his family's land for 4 generations. Instead, he stared at a mountain of concrete rubble where the silo had been just yesterday. The morning coffee mug slipped from his weathered fingers, shattering against the wooden deck. Yellow bulldozer tracks scarred the earth in perfect parallel lines, leading away from the destruction like guilty footprints. But the strangest part wasn't the demolished silo. It was the surveyor's bright orange flags planted in a precise line 20 feet closer to his house than any boundary marker had ever been. Someone had moved the property line overnight, and whoever did it had documentation claiming they owned what Garrett's grandfather had built with his own hands. 3 months had passed since his wife Rebecca's accident, and Garrett thought he had experienced every kind of loss a man could endure. He was wrong. Standing in his worn denim jacket and faded jeans, his graying hair catching the early morning light, he looked older than his 52 years. The Ashworth family's black Mercedes was parked brazenly in his driveway, engine still running. Victoria Ashworth emerged from the passenger seat, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the sunlight, wearing a crisp white business suit that probably cost more than Garrett's monthly income. Her husband Edmund followed, adjusting his expensive glasses and clutching a leather briefcase like a weapon. Their newly constructed mansion loomed behind them, complete with the massive swimming pool that had appeared 6 months ago, seemingly overnight. "Morning, Mr. Holbrook," Victoria called out with practiced sweetness that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. "I trust you received our certified letter about the property survey correction." Garrett's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I received something. Question is, how do you figure you have the right to tear down my property without so much as a conversation?" Edmund stepped forward, his polished shoes pristine despite walking across dirt and gravel. "Mr. Holbrook, according to the county records and our recent professional survey, that structure was built 14 feet inside our property line. We have every legal right to remove encroachments." The word encroachments hit Garrett like a physical blow. 4 generations of his family had farmed this land. His grandfather had built that silo in 1924, and every deed, every tax record, every piece of documentation he possessed showed it belonged to his family. "That silo's been there since before your grandparents were born, Ashworth. You moved here 6 months ago and suddenly you know more about my land than I do?" Victoria exchanged a knowing glance with her husband, the kind of look that wealthy people shared when dealing with someone they considered beneath them. She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a thick manila folder. "Perhaps this will clarify the situation." The documents inside were crisp, official, and completely contradicted everything Garrett believed about his own property. But as he studied the survey maps, something about the measurements didn't add up. The real question wasn't what the Ashworths thought they knew about his land. It was what they were trying to hide about theirs. The survey map in Garrett's calloused hands showed his property line cutting directly through what should have been his corral. According to these documents, the fence he had repaired every spring for 20 years was supposedly built on Ashworth land. But the map's date stamp made his blood run cold. It was commissioned 3 weeks ago, dated just 5 days after the Ashworths had hosted their elaborate pool party for half the county's elite. Garrett remembered that evening clearly because the music had kept his cattle restless until midnight. More importantly, he remembered seeing the surveyor's equipment near the fence line the next morning. "This map shows my fence running through your property," Garrett said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "But I've got documentation going back to 1924 that says otherwise." Victoria's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in her eyes. "Mr. Holbrook, I understand this must be confusing for someone without legal training, but property lines can be clarified when proper professional surveys are conducted. The county records were apparently based on outdated information." Edmund opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, removing additional documents that looked far more official than anything Garrett had ever seen. "These are certified by the state surveyor's office. Your grandfather's original property markers were placed incorrectly. We're simply correcting an 80-year-old mistake." But Garrett had spent 30 years working construction before returning to the family farm. He knew how to read survey maps, and something about the angles didn't make sense. The bearings listed on their survey would place his house's foundation partially on Ashworth land, which was impossible. His great-grandfather had built the house in 1891, decades before the Ashworth property had ever been divided from the original ranch. "Your survey's got the wrong reference point," he said, pointing to the bearing markers. These calculations would put my house sitting on land that didn't exist as a separate parcel until 1965. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Mr. Holbrook, we're trying to resolve this amicably. We could have simply called the sheriff to remove you for trespassing, but we respect your family's long history here. The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a grass fire. Garrett folded the survey map carefully, memorizing the technical details he would need to research later. He had learned during his construction years that when wealthy people made mistakes, they usually doubled down rather than admit error. But he had also learned that official-looking documents weren't always what they seemed to be. I appreciate your consideration, Garrett said, his tone carefully neutral. I'll need to review this with my own surveyor. Edmund laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Of course, though I should mention that hiring a professional surveyor typically costs several $1,000s. Perhaps we could arrange a reasonable settlement for your inconvenience instead. The offer confirmed what Garrett had begun to suspect. People with legitimate claims didn't usually offer settlements before the other party had even challenged them. They were in a hurry to close this matter, and hurried people made sloppy mistakes. As the Ashworths returned to their luxury vehicle, Garrett noticed something they had overlooked in their rush to intimidate him. The original iron boundary marker his grandfather had set in concrete was still visible near the old oak tree, exactly where it had always been. But according to their survey, that marker should have been 30 feet in the opposite direction. Garrett spent the rest of the morning in his late wife's office, surrounded by filing cabinets full of property documents that Rebecca had meticulously organized before her death. She had been the record keeper in their marriage, maintaining every deed, tax assessment, and survey report with the precision of a professional accountant. Her handwriting filled the margins of maps and documents, noting discrepancies she had found over the years. One folder caught his attention immediately. Boundary Disputes, 1965-2010, written in Rebecca's careful script. Inside, he found correspondence between his father and previous property owners, including a heated exchange from 1987 when a neighbor had tried to claim the creek that ran through Garrett's pasture. The 1987 dispute file contained the smoking gun he needed. His father had hired a licensed surveyor named Thomas Mackenzie to settle the creek boundary question, and Mackenzie's detailed report included precise measurements of the entire property perimeter. According to Mackenzie's professional survey, the iron boundary marker near the old oak tree was exactly where it should be. More importantly, Mackenzie's measurements placed the actual property line 42 feet northeast of where the Ashworths claimed it ran. If Mackenzie's survey was accurate, the Ashworth swimming pool and deck area were built entirely on Holbrook land. Garrett's hands trembled slightly as he cross-referenced the measurements with satellite images from the county assessor's website. The images clearly showed the Ashworth Mansion's pool positioned exactly where Mackenzie's survey indicated Holbrook property extended. But Mackenzie's report was nearly 40 years old, and Garrett needed current verification from a licensed professional. He reached for his phone and dialed the number listed on Mackenzie's old business card, hoping the surveyor might still be practicing. Mackenzie and Associates, this is Dale speaking. I'm looking for Thomas Mackenzie. He did some survey work for my family back in 1987. Tom's my father. He retired 5 years ago, but he still consults on complicated boundary disputes. What kind of situation are you dealing with? Garrett explained the demolished silo and the Ashworths' claims about incorrect property lines. Dale Mackenzie listened intently, asking detailed questions about the original iron markers and the reference points used in the new survey. When Garrett mentioned the specific bearing measurements from the Ashworth survey, Dale's tone became noticeably sharper. Mr. Holbrook, those bearings don't match any of the original township survey markers in your area. I've got my father's complete files here, and if someone's claiming your grandfather's markers were placed incorrectly, they're either mistaken or deliberately falsifying data. Professional surveyors don't make 40-foot errors on property boundaries. The younger Mackenzie agreed to meet Garrett the following morning to review the disputed boundary. His fee would be $1,500, money Garrett couldn't easily afford on a farmer's income. But Dale Mackenzie made a statement that convinced Garrett the investment was necessary. Mr. Holbrook, if someone demolished your property based on a fraudulent survey, you're not just looking at getting your silo rebuilt. You could be looking at a substantial lawsuit for property damage, trespass, and intentional destruction of historic structures. As the sun set behind the mountains, Garrett stood near the pile of rubble that had been his family's silo, studying the Ashworth mansion in the distance. Their elaborate pool party lights cast colorful reflections across the water, and he could hear laughter echoing across the valley. By tomorrow evening, those same people might be learning that their hosts had built their luxury amenities on stolen land. The thought of their shock almost made up for the heartbreak of losing the silo his grandfather had built with such pride. Dale Mackenzie arrived at dawn in a white pickup truck loaded with surveying equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything Garrett had seen during his construction days. The young surveyor was built like a ranch hand, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of years working outdoors. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who dealt with facts instead of opinions. And his first action was to locate the original iron boundary marker near the oak tree. Using a metal detector and measuring tools, he confirmed that the marker was exactly where his father had documented it in 1987. "This marker's been here since the original township survey in 1924, Dale said, brushing dirt away from the iron post. Whoever told the Ashworths it was in the wrong location was either incompetent or lying. He spent the next 2 hours taking precise measurements from multiple reference points, cross-checking his readings with GPS coordinates and comparing them to the official township records. Every calculation confirmed what Garrett had begun to suspect. The Ashworth survey was fraudulent. By mid-morning, Dale had established the true property line using 3 different measurement methods. The results were devastating for the Ashworths. Not only was Garrett's demolished silo completely on his own land, but the actual boundary ran directly through the center of the Ashworth swimming pool. The pool deck, the expensive outdoor kitchen, and the elaborate landscaping were all built on property that legally belonged to Garrett Holbrook. "Mr. Holbrook, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of boundary fraud I've encountered," Dale said, showing Garrett the measurements on his tablet computer. "The Ashworth survey claims your property line runs along their fence, but the actual line is 42 feet northeast of that fence. Their entire entertainment area is built on your land." Garrett studied the data, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what Dale had discovered. "Are you saying they knew they were building on my property?" "I'm saying someone with access to the county records and professional survey equipment deliberately created false documentation to support their trespass. This wasn't a mistake or an honest error in measurement. Someone invested significant time and money to forge these property boundaries." As if summoned by their conversation, Victoria Ashworth appeared at the fence line wearing designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than Garrett's monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and her expression carried the barely controlled fury of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Mr. Holbrook, I hope you're not planning to harass our surveyor. We have documentation proving our property rights." Dale Mackenzie stepped forward, his professional demeanor unchanged by Victoria's obvious hostility. "Ma'am, I'm a licensed surveyor conducting an independent boundary verification. According to my measurements, your swimming pool and outdoor amenities are constructed approximately 35 feet inside Mr. Holbrook's property line." Victoria's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "That's impossible. We have certified documents from the county." "Yes, ma'am, I've seen those documents. They appear to be fraudulent. The bearing measurements don't correspond to any legitimate survey markers in this township." Edmund Ashworth emerged from behind the mansion, moving quickly across his manicured lawn with his cell phone pressed to his ear. His conversation was heated but too distant to understand clearly. When he reached the fence, his usual arrogant confidence had been replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. Whatever he had learned during that phone call had clearly not been good news for the Ashworth family. "Mackenzie, I need to see your credentials and your equipment calibration certificates," Edmund demanded, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he probably used in corporate boardrooms. But Dale Mackenzie wasn't intimidated by expensive suits or legal threats. He was a professional who dealt with measurable facts, and the facts were about to destroy everything the Ashworths thought they had built on stolen land. Edmund's phone call had been to his law firm's senior partner, and the conversation had clearly not gone as expected. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the desperate energy of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. Within an hour of Dale Mackenzie's boundary confirmation, 3 black sedans arrived at the Ashworth mansion. Men in expensive suits emerged carrying briefcases and portable computers, transforming the luxury home's living room into a makeshift war room. Through the large windows, Garrett could see them spreading documents across the dining table like generals planning a military campaign. Victoria Ashworth paced back and forth across her pristine lawn, her designer heels sinking into the soft grass with each agitated step. Her phone conversations were animated and increasingly frantic, her voice carrying across the valley despite her attempts at privacy. From the fragments Garrett could overhear, she was calling surveyors, county officials, and what sounded like private investigators. Each conversation seemed to increase her frustration, rather than provide the solutions she desperately needed. Dale Mackenzie had spent the afternoon documenting everything with forensic precision. He photographed every boundary marker, recorded GPS coordinates, and created a detailed report that would serve as evidence in court. His measurements showed that the Ashworth swimming pool, outdoor kitchen, guest cabana, and decorative fountain were all constructed on Holbrook property. The financial implications were staggering. The luxury amenities represented at least $200,000 in improvements built on land they didn't own. "Mr. Holbrook, you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here," Dale said, reviewing his tablet data. The Ashworths didn't just make an innocent mistake about property boundaries. Someone paid for a fraudulent survey specifically designed to support their illegal construction project. This was premeditated theft of your land. Garrett studied the aerial photographs Dale had pulled from county records, comparing them to current satellite images available online. The timeline was damning. The Ashworths had purchased their property 8 months ago, applied for construction permits 6 months ago, and begun building their pool complex 5 months ago. But the fraudulent survey that justified their construction was dated only 3 weeks ago. Long after their building project was completed, they had built first and created false documentation afterward to cover their tracks. They knew they were trespassing when they built that pool, Garrett said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The survey was created to justify what they'd already done illegally. Dale nodded grimly, and when they realized you might discover the truth, they decided to eliminate the evidence. Your silo was a 100-year-old landmark that clearly established the historical property line. With it gone, they figured they could claim the boundary had always been disputed. As the sun began to set, Edmund Ashworth approached the fence line one final time. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his usual arrogance had been replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like panic. The legal team's presence at his house suggested he understood the gravity of his situation, but his next words proved he was still willing to fight dirty. "Holbrook, we're prepared to offer you $50,000 for the inconvenience of relocating your fence line. That's more than generous compensation for moving a boundary marker 20 feet. The offer revealed everything Garrett needed to know about Edmund's character. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of fraud and trespass, the man was still trying to buy his way out of consequences rather than admit wrongdoing. But Garrett had spent 3 months grieving his wife and 30 years working with his hands to build something honest. He wasn't about to sell his integrity for any amount of money that a corrupt lawyer thought might make the problem disappear. Garrett's rejection of Edmund's $50,000 bribe had clearly not been the response the lawyer expected. Within 24 hours, the situation escalated beyond simple property disputes into something that resembled corporate warfare. A process server arrived at Garrett's farm at dawn, delivering legal documents that accused him of making fraudulent boundary claims and demanded he cease all harassment of the Ashworth family. The lawsuit sought damages for emotional distress, defamation, and interference with peaceful enjoyment of property. Edmund Ashworth was playing hardball, using his legal resources to intimidate a grieving widower into submission. But Garrett had spent his construction years working alongside lawyers on commercial projects, and he recognized intimidation tactics when he saw them. The lawsuit was filed in the county courthouse where Edmund's law firm had represented clients for 15 years, where judges knew the Ashworth name from charitable donations and country club memberships. It was designed to be fought on Edmund's home turf, with advantages that money and connections could provide. However, Dale Mackenzie had given Garrett something more powerful than legal influence: irrefutable evidence of fraud. The next morning, Garrett drove to the county courthouse in his 20-year-old pickup truck, wearing his only good suit and carrying a folder of documents that would change everything. He had spent the previous evening researching property law online, learning about adverse possession, boundary disputes, and the legal remedies available to landowners who had been victims of trespass. The courthouse clerk, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who remembered Garrett's father, helped him file a countersuit that turned Edmund's intimidation strategy into a legal nightmare. Garrett's countersuit was devastating in its simplicity. He accused the Ashworths of intentional trespass, destruction of historic property, fraud in the procurement of building permits, and conspiracy to deprive him of his legal property rights. More importantly, he demanded immediate removal of all structures built on his land and damages equal to 3 times the value of the improvements they had constructed without permission. The legal concept of treble damages meant the Ashworths could face a $600,000 judgment for their theft. Patricia the clerk studied Garrett's paperwork with growing amazement. "Mr. Holbrook, these survey documents show their swimming pool is completely on your property. How did they get building permits for structures that aren't even on their land?" "That's exactly what I intend to find out in court," Garrett replied, signing the filing documents with the same steady hand he had used to build houses for 30 years. "And I think the county's going to be very interested in how their permitting process was manipulated." The implications of Garrett's countersuit extended far beyond the Ashworth property. If county officials had approved building permits based on fraudulent survey data, the scandal could reach into the local government offices where Edmund's law firm had cultivated relationships for years. Building inspectors, planning commissioners, and permit clerks would all face questions about how such obvious fraud had been overlooked during the approval process. Edmund Ashworth received notice of the countersuit within hours of its filing, and his response was swift and predictable. He called Garrett directly, his voice carrying none of its previous arrogance. "Holbrook, you're making a serious mistake. My firm has resources you can't possibly compete with. We'll tie you up in court for years, cost you everything you own in legal fees." But Garrett had already anticipated this threat. Dale McKenzie had referred him to a property law specialist who worked on contingency fee arrangements, meaning Garrett wouldn't pay attorney fees unless he won the case. More importantly, his case was so strong that 3 different law firms had offered to represent him after reviewing Dale's survey documentation. Edmund's intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly, transforming a simple boundary dispute into a high-profile fraud case that would soon make headlines throughout the county. "Edmund, I'll see you in court," Garrett said calmly before hanging up the phone. For the first time since Rebecca's death, he felt like himself again, a man who built things that lasted and who wouldn't be bullied by people who thought money could buy them anything they wanted. The courthouse hearing took place on a crisp October morning, 3 weeks after Garrett had filed his countersuit. Judge Harrison Martinez presided over the packed courtroom, where local ranchers and townspeople had gathered to witness what had become the most talked-about property dispute in county history. Edmund Ashworth sat at the plaintiff's table with his team of 3 lawyers, their expensive suits and leather briefcases creating an intimidating display of legal firepower. Garrett sat opposite them with his single attorney, David Chen, a property law specialist who had driven down from the state capitol specifically for this case. Edmund's legal team presented their case first, displaying enlarged copies of their survey maps on easels positioned so the judge could clearly see every detail. Their lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Bradford Hayes, argued that Garrett's boundary claims were based on outdated and inaccurate historical records that had been superseded by modern professional surveying techniques. He painted Garrett as a grieving widower who had become confused about his property lines and was now harassing successful neighbors out of misplaced resentment. "Your Honor, the defendant has allowed his emotional state following his wife's tragic death to cloud his judgment regarding legitimate property boundaries," Hayes declared with practiced sympathy. "Our clients followed all proper legal procedures in obtaining their building permits and have invested substantial resources in good faith improvements to their rightfully owned land." But when David Chen rose to present Garrett's case, the courtroom atmosphere changed dramatically. Chen had spent 2 weeks preparing multimedia presentations that would make the fraud impossible to ignore. His first exhibit was a timeline showing that the Ashworth survey was commissioned 3 weeks after their pool construction was completed, not before as building permits required. His second exhibit was Dale McKenzie's professional survey, complete with GPS coordinates that could be independently verified by the court. "Your Honor, I request permission to present physical evidence that will demonstrate the true property boundaries beyond any reasonable doubt," Chen announced, producing a tablet computer loaded with satellite imagery and survey data. "Mr. McKenzie has prepared an interactive map that shows the exact location of the disputed boundary line in relation to the existing structures on both properties." Judge Martinez leaned forward with interest as Chen activated the tablet's display on the courtroom's projection screen. The satellite image showed both properties from above, with the actual boundary line superimposed in bright red based on Dale McKenzie's professional measurements. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs as the truth became undeniably clear. The red boundary line cut directly through the center of the Ashworth swimming pool, dividing their luxury entertainment area almost perfectly in half. As the court can clearly see, Chen continued, the true property line places approximately 60% of the defendant's swimming pool, their entire outdoor kitchen, and their guest cabana on Mr. Holbrook's land. Furthermore, the demolished grain silo was located completely within Mr. Holbrook's property, making its destruction an act of criminal vandalism against a century-old historic structure. Edmund Ashworth's face had gone completely pale as the implications of the visual evidence sank in. His expensive legal team huddled together in frantic whispered conferences, clearly scrambling to find some way to challenge what everyone in the courtroom could see with their own eyes. Victoria Ashworth sat rigid in the gallery, her perfectly composed facade cracking as she realized that their luxury lifestyle had been built on a foundation of lies and theft. Judge Martinez studied the projected images for several long minutes before speaking. Mr. Hayes, does your client wish to challenge the accuracy of this survey data, or the photographic evidence showing the boundary line's relationship to the existing structures? The question hung in the air like a death sentence, and everyone present knew that the Ashworth family's legal position had just collapsed completely. Judge Martinez rendered his verdict 2 hours after reviewing all the evidence, and his judgment was swift and devastating for the Ashworth family. He ruled that the fraudulent survey constituted intentional misrepresentation designed to conceal criminal trespass, and that the demolition of Garrett's historic silo was willful destruction of property based on falsified documents. The judge ordered immediate removal of all Ashworth structures built on Holbrook land, including the swimming pool, outdoor kitchen, guest cabana, and decorative landscaping. Additionally, he awarded Garrett treble damages totaling $450,000 for the destruction of his silo and the illegal use of his property. Edmund Ashworth attempted one final desperate appeal, arguing that removing the pool would cause unreasonable financial hardship. Judge Martinez responded with barely controlled anger, stating that criminals who build on stolen land have no right to claim hardship when forced to correct their crimes. The judge also ordered a formal investigation into how the county had approved building permits based on obviously fraudulent survey data, suggesting that corruption charges might follow for any officials who had been complicit in the scheme. Within 30 days of the court ruling, bulldozers returned to the valley, but this time they came to tear down Ashworth property instead of Garrett's. The luxury swimming pool that had hosted elegant parties for the county's elite was demolished piece by piece, along with the elaborate outdoor amenities that had been built entirely on land they never owned. Victoria Ashworth supervised the destruction from inside their mansion, her face a mask of humiliated fury as workers dismantled her carefully designed entertainment area. The couple listed their property for sale within a week, unable to afford both the court-ordered damages and the cost of rebuilding their amenities on their actual property. Garrett used the damage award to rebuild his grandfather's grain silo exactly where it had always stood, hiring a construction crew that included several local ranchers who had watched the court proceedings with satisfaction. The new silo incorporated modern engineering techniques while maintaining the historic appearance that had marked his family's land for nearly a century. He also established a legal fund to help other rural property owners fight boundary fraud, ensuring that wealthy newcomers couldn't easily steal land from families who lacked resources for expensive legal battles. 6 months after the court victory, Garrett stood on his front porch at sunrise, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The rebuilt silo stood proud against the sky, a monument to persistence and the truth that had ultimately prevailed over money and corruption. In the distance, the abandoned Ashworth mansion sat empty, its for sale sign a reminder that justice had consequences for those who tried to steal what they couldn't legitimately own. The morning was peaceful, with only the sound of cattle moving through the pasture and the wind moving through the grass. Garrett smiled slightly, knowing that Rebecca would have been proud of how he had fought for their land and won. The valley belonged to the families who had worked it honestly for generations, not to wealthy outsiders who thought they could buy or steal whatever they wanted. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.